Hello and welcome back to the Envisiontech podcast. I'm your host Paul Gagan, and this week we're going to be talking about making good software. For a while now, I've been wanting to do this episode, but actually I recently came across a post on LinkedIn that really made me think about this idea again. And that's the idea that a lot of people who make software don't really consider what their users actually want. A lot of software developers have a favorite programming language or a favorite framework, and we will argue about which one's better and why it's better. But a lot of users, number one, don't know about these things, and honestly, they don't care. They just care about whether it works or not. So I wanted to make this episode to talk a bit about what exactly is good software and how exactly can it be made good. As I've mentioned before, I have a good bit of experience now as a software engineer, and I also, just like that, have a favorite language and a favorite framework, but it's really important for me to consider who's actually going to be using my software. Whether it be a website or something else that I'm making, I need to think who's actually going to use this. Because, I'm blind, so I could just easily say, well, actually, this doesn't need to look nice because I don't care. But then anybody who, can see and goes to that website, they'll be like, wow, this looks terrible. Yeah, it works, and that's probably great. But it really doesn't look nice at all. It's just really basic and it's not very enjoyable to use. Maybe even, it's hard for people who can see to use because I haven't really considered that. And that would be a bit ridiculous, Just like how if somebody makes a website and they make it in a way that I can't use it, that's also a bit ridiculous. So it's really important to consider who's actually going to use your website, or even just who could use your website. Because even if, for example, your website is built for people who know a lot about technology and, they are within this certain demographic, somebody else who might not know a lot about technology and who might not fit that demographic might come across your website, and you still don't want them to have a bad experience. This episode, as I mentioned, is going to focus on making good software for everybody. So it's not just going to be about accessibility and making things work with screen readers, although that's part of the episode. That's not all you should consider when you're making software or a website, because you should be considering everybody and all of their abilities and all of their backgrounds. So whether they're, an 18-year-old who uses technology every day, whether they're a 25-year-old who doesn't like technology very much, but they have to use your banking app, or whatever it is. They might be 50 and it's their first time using, a computer. They might be, 6 and it's their first time using a website. So it's really important to consider all these people. Even if most of the people that use your app or your website or whatever it is can use it perfectly fine, there'll be somebody like me who comes along who uses a screen reader and, well, actually, you didn't consider that, and your app doesn't work for me, So, I suppose the current challenge is, as I've mentioned a little bit, you will have a meeting with somebody and you'll say, okay, well, who are we targeting this towards? And you'll pick somebody. You'll pick a group, if you will, of individuals. So even if you're making a game, for example, a lot of game studios will sit down, they'll say, okay, well, we want to target this group of people, so we want to make a mobile game, or actually we want to target this group of people, so we're going to make a console game, and we're going to have these things, and we're not going to have these things, so it might not sound like a big deal, but it is, because as I said before, people who aren't part of your target audience are probably going to use whatever it is that you make. And also, if you just target one audience, well, then that's all you're ever going to get, as opposed to everybody else. So you should actually be designing things, keeping in mind your core demographic, obviously, because, you want it to still appeal to those people, but you also want it to appeal to others that aren't part of that demographic and who, might be able to expand your demographics. Then next time you're making a website, an app, or a game, you can be like, oh, well, actually, we want to target all these people now because now we're not just catering to one demographic. This becomes particularly apparent for people with disabilities. So let's say you're making the next YouTube, okay? So you have a team of software engineers, you might be a software engineer, whoever you are, and your app or website, whatever it's going to be, is going really well. You're getting more and more users every day, and it seems to only be going up. But you run into a problem. You have thousands and thousands of hours of videos now uploaded to your new platform, and you don't have captions. So, maybe somebody who's deaf downloads your app, and it might be the first deaf person who downloads your app. We don't know. Because if there were other people before, maybe they would have left. Because you don't have captions. So they click on a video, they are excited, they're like, oh wow, this is actually a person that I like, I maybe follow them somewhere else, and they're on this like new platform, and they are excited to watch the video, but there's no captions. So, and look, obviously, there's exceptions to these things, but in general, if there are no captions or anything like that, or subtitles, I know that those are different, they can't enjoy that video, and same for me. If I go on Netflix and there's a movie on Netflix right now, and I've been waiting to watch it, I've been excited for it to come out, and I go on there and it doesn't have audio description, honestly, I might not watch it. Even if I have been excited, I might say, you know what, actually, I'm going to watch this other thing, this has audio description, or I'm going to watch this other show that actually doesn't really need audio description. And now, just because it doesn't need audio description doesn't mean it shouldn't have it, but some shows, they're a bit easier to watch without it. But it's just, excluding people. And look, I always mention the sensory disabilities just because I feel like those are, number one, the easiest for me to explain to people, and also I understand them the best because I have one. So that's just a small example of the challenge right now. If you're not deaf and not blind, you're just making that new YouTube app, you might not consider the fact that somebody who's deaf might want to watch those videos, or somebody with a bad internet connection might want to watch those videos, or somebody who has never used like a phone before, maybe somebody who's older, and their vision has decreased because of that, or maybe, as I said, somebody who's blind, somebody who can't use a phone in a traditional way. Maybe they use something that they plug into their phone, or they use a braille display in order to navigate around, or there's all sorts of different things there that you might not consider. So it's really important to actually make sure that when you sit down and you're planning things like this, even if you're not a software engineer, even if you're just planning a design for a building, or releasing a product or whatever it might be, even a book, making sure that there's an ebook available, for example, because I can't read a print book, but I could probably read the ebook, and if I can't read the ebook, well, then maybe you have an audiobook so I can listen to that, and that's personally how I really like to listen to books, but also it's just good for you. Like, that will just make you have a bigger audience and hopefully make you more money as well. And just to be clear, there are a lot of companies out there who are doing these things, but even a lot of those companies are just doing it to be compliant with certain laws or whatever it might be, that's in their country. And yeah, that's great. I'm glad that we have those laws, because it forces companies who otherwise might not want to do these things, or just even individuals who might not care, or really think about it, to actually do these things. But it's important to go beyond just complying with these things, because in reality, if you were designing an app or a website or anything like that, I said even a building or a product or a book, whatever it is, well, you're just going to have more people who can have access it. So, for example, for a website, right? If you have a good user interface, I mean, that's just going to be helpful for everybody. If you have a dyslexia-friendly font, again, that's going to probably benefit most people, and especially people with dyslexia, which again is a pretty significant portion of people. So why would you choose to exclude those? It just doesn't make any sense. It's like when you're planning a building. Why have parts of the building that wheelchairs can't have access to? Or why would you stop wheelchairs from being able to access the building at all? Because if you're, building that building or designing it or whatever it is, and, maybe a business rents it out and they're selling something from that building, I mean, they're probably going to lose out on the business of those wheelchair users, for example. So I could sit here all day and talk about examples for people with disabilities, but even having a mobile first design, right? Like that helps everybody, because in reality, a lot of people are visiting your website from their phones now. And even if they're not and they're visiting it on a computer, well, I mean, the mobile first design will ensure that number one, it works really well on phones, which is where it needs to work the best, because phones aren't as powerful as actual computers and people can still use it on a computer. And usually you would have separate designs for those sorts of things. And that also benefits like everybody who wants to use a touchscreen. So even if you are on an actual computer, but your app can work with a touchscreen or whatever it is, then that's going to be able to benefit people actually using it on a computer. If your website works well with touchscreens, then it's going to work well on phones and it's going to work well on desktops as well, which is only a good thing. So, I mean, what can you do about this? Well, usually you want to actually understand your users. And again, this is applicable to anything, but we're going to talk specifically about technology. So, you want to conduct some user research. So, that can happen in a lot of different ways, but essentially, it's important because you want to understand what your users actually want, what they need, and what might be a problem. So if you're designing a website and let's say it targets people who, might not use technology all the time and they want a quick solution, so you don't want to have loads of different menus with loads of different options that they have to go through. You want them to be able to maybe go on the website, input something, click a button or two, and it's done. Because otherwise they might not use it. So it's about knowing who you actually want to use your website. And I said it's also important to consider people that you may not be targeting necessarily. So usually that's done by doing things like surveys. You might actually conduct user interviews and usability testing. So obviously if you're doing a proof of concept or something, you might send around a survey. You'll say, okay, well, if we made this website, what do you think of this idea? What about this feature? Have you used something like this before? What have you thought about that? What do you think it did well? What did it do badly? So that you can kind of maybe hopefully do better, than that pre-existing thing. And obviously if it's something new, then you would ask slightly different questions. And even the usability testing is really important to make sure that your website or app, whatever it is actually usable. And I know that sounds a bit simple because, most things are usable. But by usable, I mean easily usable. Somebody can go on there, get what they need to do done in, a reasonable amount of time given the task. And they shouldn't have to be looking around for all these different buttons. They shouldn't be confused about what the icons mean. Any of that sort of stuff. It's important to kind of figure out what might cause problems. Another way you might do this is by using personas and scenarios. So what I mean by that is you might say, okay, well, we have a website here. Let's say, I'm just going to use myself for this example. So let's say Paul comes along, he's blind and he's using a screen reader. Well, how would he use our website? Are we missing anything? How would his experience be? Would he be able to get to this section of the website? When he clicks that button and this pop-up shows up on the screen, will he be aware of that? Will he know when this finishes downloading? Whatever it might be. It's important to come up with these different scenarios and personas. Let's say Alice. She lives in a rather remote area and she has bad internet. So how would our website perform or our app perform if maybe your internet connection wasn't, super fast? Would it still work? If it does still work, how slow is it? Is there anything that we can do to improve that? Because even if you do have a good internet connection, that would make it faster for you as well. So, using these different personas, you can help these individual users use the website better, which is great. But usually, what you end up doing is actually just improving it for everybody. As I said, if you make it so that you are sending less data or it somehow gets there faster, well, then that's only a good thing for everybody. And yeah, Alice might benefit the most from that. Maybe instead of taking 40 seconds for something to happen, it now takes 5. That's a big deal. That's 8 times faster. And yeah, for me, it might, go from 2 seconds to half a second. But still, that's still a benefit from everybody, for everybody. So I want to talk a little bit more about usability and what exactly does it look like when you design with usability in mind. So what you want to do is you want to essentially just make sure that things make sense. And that's the most basic way for me to put it, but I mean, that's kind of how it works. So it's about organizing content in a logical and intuitive way. So, if we have a save button, for example, maybe we don't want to have the rename button in the exact opposite corner of the screen. That wouldn't make much sense. If we have a nav bar at the top of the website, you don't want the home link on the left, then you want the search button, then you have the logo, then you have another button that has a random icon on it. Maybe you're not entirely sure what that means. Then you have another image, then you have another link. You kind of want to make sure that the design makes sense. So, and not to say that, you can't make things that look a bit different and that are creative, and that you can't do things in different ways, but it's about making sure that it actually makes sense. Even with how you label things. So I said if you have a button, for example, and having text on it is great. So it might say like save file, or it might say send email, or whatever it is. But you also might have icons on there, and it's important to not just have random icons. It's important to make sure that people can actually understand what those icons mean. So instead of having the word send email on a button, you might have an actual letter icon. And by that I mean like a letter that you post, not as in A or B or C. And to most people that will signify, okay, well, this is to send an email. They'll understand the correlation there between that mail icon and, an email. But sometimes people just kind of pick icons that they think make sense to them, but they don't think, okay, well, I don't know this person. They come on to my website, they see this icon. What might they think it means? Because it might be very different to whatever you think it means. So even using consistent design throughout your website or your app. So if you go onto one page and you have the nav bar at the top, and then you go on to the next page and the nav bar is at the bottom, and then you go on to the next page and it's on the left, you go on to the next page and it's on the right, you go on to the next page and there's no nav bar. You have to expand it out from somewhere. That's a bad user experience. That has not really been considered very well by whoever made that product, because users really love consistency. Even I do. When I'm using an app, if let's say the back button on an app is always in the top left, but then on one page it's on the top right, or it's on the bottom right. Every time I go to that page, I'm like, oh yeah, this is the page where the back button is in the wrong place. Because that's how it can seem. It seems like it's wrong, or like it was some kind of mistake. So even if you did it, on purpose for whatever reason, a user might not actually think that it's meant to be that way, and they probably won't be very happy about it. It's also important to consider color contrast, which is important, number one, for people who might be colorblind or who have difficulty reading, who have other like vision difficulties, but it's just better for everybody. If there's a good contrast, it's easier to read the text. You don't have to strain your eyes, and it's just more enjoyable for everybody to use. Even designing for multiple screen sizes and resolutions. Yet again, this can benefit people with disabilities. Maybe they use a device with a larger screen or whatever it might be, but it's just good for everybody. If somebody uses a phone that has a 5-inch screen, or if somebody uses a phone that has an 8-inch screen, which is a big difference, it should still look nice. So many times have I, number one, gone to a website or been helping redesign a website for somebody. You go on there and the images are terrible when you're on more than a tiny screen, because they didn't consider, well, somebody might actually use a bigger screen than I do. It's not just about, okay, well, what works for me on my device? It's about, okay, well, what works for everybody on every device? Because that's who you're making it for. You don't actually know what kind of device that those people are going to be using. Now, okay, to be fair, sometimes you might. But even then, it's usually important to make it for people who might not be using that exact device. And yes, I am going to talk about accessibility a bit because it's really important. There's the WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a good starting point for anybody, really. And yet again, a lot of these things apply to a lot of different areas, and they are specifically meant for the web, but a lot of these principles make sense even outside of that. So, a couple of the key points are things like providing alt text for images, which, that is specific to the web. So if you go to a website and you're using a screen reader, it should still tell you what the image is, even if you can't see. But even that principle of remembering that, okay, there's a picture here, or there is something that somebody who's blind can't experience, is there a way that we can provide another way of them accessing that, whether it's through text or audio or whatever it might be? As I mentioned, color contrast. That's a really big deal, and a lot of places do that wrong, but it's really, really important. Making content compatible with screen readers. I am forever talking about this, and I will until it gets better, because way too often do I go to a website and it just doesn't work, or I download an app and it doesn't work. Even, I think it was today, actually, I was downloading a new app that is supposedly good for learning Spanish. And I was downloading, I saw, this has, however many downloads. It's actually not, millions and millions and millions. The odds of this being accessible aren't great, And I've kind of become pessimistic now because of how many bad experiences I've had. And that will kind of cause me to say, actually, I don't really want to try this new app. I'm just going to stick to the one that I'm using. It has its problems, but I don't want to try out new stuff because it's probably not going to be accessible, especially because a lot of the time you might have to pay. If it's free, I might check it out and see what it's like. But especially if it's paid, I'm not going to spend money on something if I don't even know if I can use it. It doesn't make any sense at all. So, yet again, really important. And just a couple more advanced things, some of these I've already mentioned too. So, audio description. I did mention that earlier, but again, really, really important. Like, again, if you don't include things like that, you're just losing out on part of your audience. And you might think, it's only a few people, but let's say there's 10 million people using your website. Maybe there'd be an extra million or two if, it was properly accessible. Or, if you released a movie and it made however much money. Well, you might make 10, 20% more if that movie had audio description. So, again, it's really important to consider things like that. I said dyslexia-friendly fonts, really important. Options for text magnification. And I've seen a lot of websites that use accessibility plugins, and I personally don't like them. I'm not saying they don't work for everything, and some of them are better than others. But honestly, just design things right. And it's not hard. I know, I'm making a whole podcast episode about it, and it probably seems like a lot of information. But in reality, all it boils down to is just think before you make something. Think about it. Okay, if somebody wants to use my website, can they? If somebody who's blind wants to use my website, can they? If somebody who has bad internet wants to use my website, can they? If someone wants to use my website on their phone, can they use it? If someone wants to use my website on a desktop, can they use it? Like, it only takes probably a couple of minutes to really think through these things and say, okay, have I considered all these possibilities? Yes. And it does get a bit more complicated than that, and it does depend on what you're making. But in reality, for most people in most scenarios, it's pretty straightforward. It's, could this person use it? No? Okay. How can I fix that? Because that's a problem. So just a couple of quick things before we finish up here. So it's really important that whatever you're making should be flexible and customizable if possible, letting people change the color of the font or the color of the background or whatever it might be, change the font size. As I said, adding in options for, magnification or making sure that it works when you zoom in. There's plenty of things. Even letting people add their own keyboard shortcuts. So let's say you're making a new version of Microsoft Word or Google Docs. Having a nice looking toolbar is great and you have all these options, but it takes a while to get through the menus. It takes somebody who uses a screen reader even longer if they can even use it. But if they can just press Control and H, or Alt and H or whatever it is to do whatever action they want, I mean, number one, it's just better for everybody because even people who don't use screen readers use keyboard shortcuts. They'll use a keyboard shortcuts because a lot of time they're faster than going through the menu, clicking on this option, clicking on that option, clicking on that option. They just press Control Alt L, whatever it is. And it just immediately does whatever those, 5-10 seconds of clicking would have done in half a second. And even considering your user experience levels. So yeah, if you've made that new version of Microsoft Word, it might be great if you've been using Microsoft Word for the past 20 years. But let's say you have never used Microsoft Word or Google Docs, you download this thing or you go to the website and you have no idea what any of these menus are or what any of these buttons do. I mean, that's going to be terrible and it's going to really limit who will actually use that product. So considering, I said, number one, the beginners who may be using your app, or even maybe the more advanced people, because you also want them to be able to do things like use keyboard shortcuts or have advanced settings. It's important to consider everybody in between that too. Even having tutorials, if you can, or text instructions, so that if somebody does get stuck on something, then they're not going to just leave. Even as a developer, if I am trying to use a tool and it doesn't have any documentation, I'm probably just not going to use it. Even if I could, and even if it's good, I'm going to say, okay, well, if I have a problem with this, or if I want to change this in the future, well, I'm going to have to look through all this code myself. I'm going to have to figure out how all of it works, and that might change by the time I'm done reading through it all, especially with something particularly big. So I might just go find something that has better documentation, because it's just easier for me to use, and it's clear that the person who made it actually thought about it. They thought, okay, well, people are going to use this. It's not just going to be me. So let's have some instructions. Let's have some tutorials, some examples, whatever it might be. Making sure that you're actually testing things properly is also really important. As I mentioned earlier, user testing is super important. And you might not think so. You might think, oh, well, there's no problems with my app or my website. There's no bugs. It's perfect. And then, you release it, and after 2 hours, you have 1,000 bug reports, and now you don't know what to do. You're freaking out because there's all these problems, all these people saying that they can't use your app because actually you didn't check if it worked on this version of Android or on this screen size or on this particular brand of phone or whatever it might be, and now people are leaving your app bad reviews, and now people aren't going to download it anymore if they look on the Play Store and they see, oh wow, this app has 1.5 stars, but the other one below it has, 4.2. I'm going to get the one that has 4.2, obviously. Even if your app is really good, and even if it is actually better than that one that's lower down on the list, well, they're probably not going to even check yours out and find out why it might be better. So it's important to check if things actually work with users, and there's multiple ways to do that. You can have actual individual user testing, you can have beta programs, there's all sorts of options for that. But especially making sure that people who maybe are outside of your target demographic are included in that. And also people who have disabilities or who are maybe in different scenarios than the majority of people. I said somebody with, maybe less good of an internet connection, and there are ways that you can simulate that as well, to be fair. But I said making sure that actually works with a screen reader, or that somebody who actually is colorblind is able to navigate around on your app is super important. So that'll help you identify, number one, usability problems, because maybe you'll say, oh, well, actually, Daniel had a bit of a problem when he was trying to find this section of the menu. So, maybe we could make it more clear where that is. Maybe we could highlight it in a way by using a different color, or maybe we should increase the font size, for this particular heading or this particular button, because it didn't stand out enough and it took him a little bit to find it. And he said that it was really frustrating because he kept looking through all these other menus and it wasn't in there. It's really important to make sure that you actually do all these things beforehand, because that'll happen to me. I'll make something, I'll be like, wow, this works really well. I'm really proud of this. It's so cool. And I'll, tell my wife about it. She'll be like, oh, that sounds cool. Can I have a look at it? Can I try it out? She'll have a look, and every time she finds a way to break it. She's like, oh, well, actually, I tried to click this button and it actually did this instead. And I'm like, oh, yeah, well, I never even thought about that. So then I have to go back and I have to fix it. And, that's just obviously with one other person. So if you're doing that with, even a dozen or 100 or 1,000, obviously depending on how big your app or website is, it can make a really big difference, and it will help resolve a lot of problems before they even show up. Obviously then you need to actually iterate. And by that I mean, so you actually take those different results into account, and you will release a new version of your app, or you will, whatever it is, you'll change the design of your website. You will move that button. You will change the color of that icon, whatever it might be. It's really, really important. So just as a quick recap, essentially what this episode comes down to is just thinking about things. So the things that you need to think about are actually centering your design around the users, not around what you think it should be, but around what they actually want, around it being accessible. And I don't even mean in terms of screen readers, because that is really important, but accessible to everybody, whether they have good or bad internet or whatever it might be. It shouldn't matter. So it's important to make sure that everybody can use your product, your website, or whatever it might be. So make sure that the next time you're planning something, you're designing something, you're building something, you're making something, no matter what it is, to just stop for a second and think about it. That is it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This has been the Envisiontech podcast, and as always, I've been your host, Paul Gagan. See you all next week.